Hey guys, welcome to the latest episode of the 40/40 Vision podcast, the ultimate sports history pod where hindsight is 40/40. We're so excited to jump into today's episode, but before we do, here's a quick word from one of our sponsors. What's up, everybody? Welcome to another edition of 40/40 Shorts from the 40/40 Vision podcast. This is our short form format where we cover a sports history topic in about 5 to 15 minutes to make you a more informed sports fan. Today's clip is actually a cut from episode 2 of the 40/40 Vision podcast, where we cover the top 5 what-if moments in San Francisco 49ers history. In this clip, we jump into the scenario where what would have happened had the San Francisco 49ers drafted Aaron Rodgers way back in 2005. We discuss what the 49ers would have looked like, what the rest of the NFL would have looked like had this happened. We discuss the reasons why the 49ers chose Alex Smith over Aaron Rodgers. And the funniest part about this podcast is that we recorded this on January 2nd, 2022, and it was just a few weeks before Aaron Rodgers suffered yet another embarrassing loss at the hands of the San Francisco 49ers in the playoffs. So we didn't get a chance to discuss that, obviously, because it hadn't happened yet, but it just adds another hilarious wrinkle to the rivalry between the 49ers, the Packers, and of course between Aaron Rodgers and the 49ers. So make sure you keep that in mind when you're listening, and let's jump right in.
This was exciting because I'm a 49ers fan, and a lot of this is pretty recent for the most part. The Niners have been a storied franchise with a lot of great quarterbacks, so a lot of this will be very quarterback heavy. But I do think that after listening, of course, this is our opinion, but after listening, that you'll agree with a lot of these choices and how it would have been interesting to see if an alternate scenario played out. So my first one on the list is, what if the 49ers drafted Aaron Rodgers instead of Alex Smith? Now, Alex Smith did have a great season at Utah. He was the number 1 overall pick. Aaron Rodgers really wanted to be drafted by the 49ers. He grew up in California. He grew up a 49ers fan. He also had a good career at Cal Berkeley, but ultimately they passed on him because they thought he was arrogant when they interviewed him. Now, Alex Smith did have some numbers. You actually have those numbers, right? What were Alex Smith's numbers?
I do. So I do remember reading that they did pass on him because they thought he was arrogant, which he is. I mean, as we've gotten to know Aaron Rodgers over the last almost 20 years, we kind of know what kind of guy he is. But there was a couple of other factors, of course. The first is that Alex Smith had an incredible junior season at Utah. He accounted for almost 4,000 yards. He had 3,000 passing yards, 35 passing touchdowns, 700 rushing yards, and 10 rushing touchdowns. So he was an incredible dual threat quarterback. He was kind of everything that you were looking for in the modern day NFL quarterback. He was an athlete. He had good size. He was accurate, and all of those things translated, to his pro career. So it wasn't like they picked an unknown or, a nobody type quarterback. He had a pretty good resume. And the other factor was, I think that a lot of teams were starting to get scared of the Jeff Tedford quarterbacks. That was a starting to become a theme, right? So there's a couple other guys that were taken early that were coached by the quote unquote QB guru, Jeff Tedford, guys like David Carr, Kyle Bowler, Joey Harrington. All these guys were top picks that ultimately flamed out, and people were starting to think, is Aaron Rodgers just another guy in that list? Is he another product of the Tedford system with some inflated numbers? And, he's a system quarterback. So that just to color the conversation as to why the Niners picked Alex Smith over Rodgers.
Yeah, that's a good summary. I'll never believe any of the other reasons except that the brass thought he was arrogant. That's how I'm always going to view it. It's just poor judgment. It was arrogant. We don't want an arrogant quarterback here. We are the franchise of Montana. No arrogance here. So, I mean, coincidentally, they had a shot at him last summer, too, in the summer of 2021. They could have just traded for him, but they traded the farm for a rookie that I'll probably end up mentioning that a couple of times, the Trey Lance thing. So he played against the Niners 12 times. He played in all 12 games, which goes between 2009 and 2021, which shows how healthy he's been throughout his career. And he played 5 different quarterbacks in those 12 games: Alex Smith, Troy Smith, Colin Kaepernick, Nick Mullins, CJ Beathard, and Jimmy Garoppolo. Now, he vowed to always play really hard against the 49ers. He wanted to prove a point that his favorite team should have drafted him. And the funny part is he went 6-6 in those 12 games against the 49ers and 0-4 in the postseason, which is really the more jarring part of this. He lost to Alex Smith a couple times. He lost to Colin Kaepernick. Alex Smith won Colin Kaepernick twice. And then Jimmy Garoppolo in the NFC Championship game, where it was an absolute just bludgeoning 2 times that year in I think a Sunday Night Football game, and then the same result where Raheem Mostert ran for 1 million yards.
Those weren't even competitive, either of those games.
Yeah. And the one at Candlestick where Kaepernick ran for over 200 yards or close to 200 yards. So that's the amazing part, is that when he did play them, he didn't have his best games in the postseason. He had some great games in the regular season, though. So long story short, I'll try to keep it short. Terry Donahue was the GM. He fired Steve Mariucci, and then they fired him in 2005 because he hired Dennis Erickson. That didn't work with Jeff Garcia and Tim Rattay. So Mike Nolan was hired, but for whatever reason, ownership didn't draft the GM. So Mike Nolan drafts Alex Smith. And Aaron Rodgers says, "I will defeat you throughout my career." And now, to be fair, the quality of their draft picks were really quite good. They drafted Frank Gore in that time period, Patrick Willis, Vernon Davis, Michael Crabtree, up until the end of that decade. And a lot of those guys became the core of the team during their peak when Jim Harbaugh inherited the team. So, but looking back, given that this franchise just has such a huge standard for quarterbacks, it's a huge miss. I mean, the Packers had Brett Favre in the early 90s, and then they went right into Aaron Rodgers. It's like almost 30 years of quarterback excellence, which is incredibly lucky. And the Niners missed out.
All pro level quarterback play. That's with no drop off is completely unheard of.
Every year, competitive every year, amazing Pro Bowl championship aspiration quarterback play every year. Even though Brett Favre, just threw 1 million interceptions, he was still great every year. So here's my what if scenario. I don't want to drag this on too long. The Niners draft Aaron Rodgers, and they win 4 Super Bowls at least with Aaron Rodgers. He doesn't win one with Mike McCarthy's incompetence, or even Matt LaFleur's incompetence kicking field goals instead of letting the GOAT just go for it. He plays in the second year instead of waiting 4 years behind Brett Favre. Mike Nolan stays maybe an extra year, and the team gets some sort of quality head coach. I don't know who was out there at the time. NFL head coaches aren't as sexy as NBA head coaches in terms of who is appealing. It could be anyone's offensive, defensive coordinator, whatever the case may be.
But that's a pretty attractive job with Aaron Rodgers and Frank Gore and Patrick Willis
and they have Terrell Owens. Maybe they keep Terrell Owens at that point somehow. I think he ends up leaving like that year or the year before. He gets Terrell Owens in this beautiful scenario. Who never leaves the team because he's got Aaron Rodgers. He doesn't go to the Cowboys or the Eagles or wherever else he went.
He famously butted heads with Jeff Garcia and any other quarterback he's played with. So.
Yeah, he's just got Aaron Rodgers, and he loves him to death because he feeds him the ball perfectly into his helmet every time he throws it to him. And he also doesn't go through this 49ers boogeyman buzzsaw that thwarted him 4 times in the postseason. The Niners always famously had, as a kid, I used to cry. The Niners lost to the Packers 3 years in a row in the postseason in the mid-90s. So this doesn't happen to him. He loses just one time like he did in our reality to Russell Wilson, like he did in Green Bay in 2014. But he still beats Pittsburgh. He beats New England instead of Seattle playing and losing to New England. And Jim Harbaugh wins 2 Super Bowls with Aaron Rodgers. So things play out a lot differently if he just comes home to San Francisco. And I think that if he had come this season, it would have been an amazing season, given how Jimmy Garoppolo threw a pick in every game this year and they lost those games. Rodgers has been amazing this year at like 37 years old, 38 years old. So that's my what if. If Aaron Rodgers came here, everything would have been peachy and the Hall of Fame-esque, and we get spoiled with another great quarterback.
Yeah, and I think the worst loss for Rodgers, I think, is or in the playoffs at least, was that 2014 year where Kaepernick and that team went into Lambeau, and they didn't embarrass them the way they did last year, but or not last year, but in 2019. But you could argue that the Niners were the better team in 2019 and 2012. But in 2013, I think the Packers were 14-2 and were a Super Bowl favorite. So, all right.
Aaron Rodgers is always a fascinating what if because, of course, how late he went in the draft. I think all the great quarterbacks that are late picks, if you think of Tom Brady or even Russell Wilson, even though I wouldn't put him in the great conversation, but all these guys can pose interesting what ifs for just about all the teams in the NFL, but especially for the 49ers because of all the links that Rodgers has to the Niners, of course, growing up in Northern California, not quite the Bay Area. And the fact that the Niners picked, a guy named Alex Smith over him for all the reasons that we covered in the podcast. So in a situation where he does go to San Francisco, again, as we covered in that clip, there's a lot of interesting what ifs, including the Super Bowls, including what would have happened with the Packers. And interestingly enough, if you ask Aaron Rodgers, despite the playoff losses that he's had to the 49ers, some of the more high-profile ones especially, if you ask him, which I think a reporter has, he says that, he's had the better career and things have gone better for him than they have for the 49ers because, of course, he's won a Super Bowl and they have not won a Super Bowl during his career. They've been there twice, but they fell short probably because of the quarterback position. So you would think that if that's Aaron Rodgers trying to complete that pass to Emmanuel Sanders instead of Jimmy Garoppolo, that's probably a completion. Maybe Aaron Rodgers finds Vernon Davis or Michael Crabtree in the back of the end zone against Baltimore. So there's a lot of really interesting what ifs. And I think we can assume that given the other talent the 49ers have had on this squad, given the incredible defensive players, the pretty good coaches, some great coaches, I guess you could say, I think it's fair to assume that they would have won at least one Super Bowl, maybe even two. So with that, hope you guys enjoyed the episode. Please make sure to subscribe wherever you're listening to this podcast. Make sure to follow us on all these social media platforms at 4040 Vision Pod. Thanks, y'all. Peace out.